Freestyle in the anchor. Don't write that shit. Freestyle in the anchor.
Hello,
What's up?
this is AirGo.
It is indeed.
I'm Kiss.
I'm Damon.
And what we do here is reshape culture for the more liberatory and creative. Dame, how you doing? How's the world treating you? How you treating it?
The world is treating me well. I'm giving it what I can. How you doing?
I'm doing decent. I feel like this conversation that we have today to share with you actually helped me move through some of the questions that I've been wrestling with. And we have the honor of wrestling through those questions with the brilliant playwright and author, Zayd Ayers Dohrn. Zayd's new book, Dangerous, Dirty, Violent, and Young, is out now, and it's this continued deep dive into his experience and the experience of his parents as members of the Weather Underground, moving through the radicalism of the 60s, being a central part in trying to build revolution right here at home, and the questions and contradictions that emerge from that. It was really exciting to learn more about the story, both from him and his parents through our personal relationships, but really in his show, Mother Country Radicals, a great podcast that came out a couple years ago. And then with this brand new book that starts to try to address and think through some of the questions that came up and didn't quite get answered in building the podcast about it.
And in this time of the world shifting in really significant ways, I think it's important that we look into these archives and these legacies of what radicalism has looked like in our society and around the world. And what Zayd does and what Zayd offers us is not only, I think a sterile historical look at politics and tactics, but really a human and intergenerational study of what it means to make these large commitments and also the impacts it has on the people around us.
Yeah, it was a wonderful conversation, and like I said, brought me, if not some answers, at least some feeling of being less alone in the soup together in this time of destabilization and decay.
Yeah. And if you enjoyed this conversation, go back and check out a few episodes back, episode with Bill Ayers, and go in the audio archive and definitely listen to the story of Bernardine Dohrn.
Yeah, and I guess this answers the rest of our booking. We'll just keep moving through the family here. And make sure you go get the book out now, listen to Mother Country Radicals, subscribe to AirGo, write, review, all those good things. Subscribe to us on YouTube. You can hit the subscribe button below. And
big Substack.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Hit us on the Substack. Find us there.
Subscribe wherever you get your pods.
And with that, anything else you want to share?
That's all I got.
All right, let's hop into it with Zayd Ayers Dohrn.
Let's get it.
All right, we are here. We are back at it in our Goose Island studios, and we are so excited to be sitting down and chopping it up and getting to know the wonderful Zayd Ayers Dohrn is here.
Say.
Wow, that was some good syllable extending.
Yeah.
Have you ever heard your name in 2 syllables before?
I haven't. It's funny. I feel like I started using the 3 names because each one is only 1 syllable. It's not enough,
That does hit.
Had to extend it a little bit.
You ever consider Zad?
No, I've never considered it.
It worked. I'm just saying from an initial, in the, a Zaddy era situation, there's a lot there for you. ZAD. Now that we've given you problematic advice. One, thank you for being down to be here.
Sure,
and we'll start in the same way we start every episode, which is with this 2-part question that centers around time. That could be this hour, this day, this season, this lifetime. But in this time, how is the world treating you, and how are you treating the world, Zayd?
I mean, the world, my little world is treating me really well. My daughters are grown-ups all of a sudden, and they're treating me well. My wife is my wonderful partner in life, and my parents are still with us. So I feel like my nuclear world is good. How the world is treating me, I mean, it's a mess out there. I feel privileged to be in a bubble of people who are trying to live through it and fight back against what's going on out there. So I can't say that the world is treating me bad, but the world is treating a lot of people badly. And so I feel like I think about that a lot. How I'm treating the world, I'm trying to be a good dad, be a good husband, trying to write into the madness, I'm trying to do all those things. I'm not always succeeding, but I'm trying.
So to that, the feeling of being enveloped in a bubble of people trying to do things.
Yeah.
I think about this a lot as we go out and talk about our work of like what being in that bubble offers, because it doesn't offer solutions and it doesn't offer like peace.
No.
But it offers something. What do you think being around people who are actively trying to do something offers to the person in the midst of it?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it offers purpose and hope. You know, like I think a lot of people feel in this country and around the world, like, what am I supposed to be doing? And part of what I mean by privilege is I feel like here in Chicago and all around the world, I feel the people I hang out with, you guys, everybody's trying something, you know, and not always like something that's gonna make everything better, but just trying something, and that makes you feel like you have models for what engaging in the world might look like, you know. So for me, in my little world, I feel like the writers who I admire and who I love and whom I've come up with, you know, seeing what they're writing into this and seeing how they're trying to make sense of the world helps me try to make sense of the world, you know.
This brings up a conversation I was having with somebody, kind of like giving them some counsel, some confidant support as they were just like moving through interpersonal relationships.
Can you just spill all of the details?
all the
publicly?
very
Really
hyper specifics of it? No, but like what came to was this difference between just being a good person, and I think most people in society almost like are like take their personhood as a given or as like set or as something that like they either were born into or now is shaped. And then those in this bubble that we're talking about who have like made this commitment towards whether changing the world or changing something in their environment, like reflects in them that I need to be changing. So the difference between like, oh, I'm a good person and like take me where I'm at versus like I am always striving to shift and be what is needed or be in responsibility or be symbiotic in ecosystem flow. Like there's this, I think, distinction. I couldn't find the language for it, so I'm bringing it to y'all in this moment to like, can we parse this out of, there's this difference between just people who are not assholes, which is like, oh, great, like, thanks, versus people who are like radically committed to care and relationship because of this larger responsibility. How, do y'all feel that, or how does that show up?
I hear that, yeah. I mean, I think it's funny because I think if everybody would just not be assholes, things would be good.
Right.
But we have the assholes, so then some people have to be like actively resisting that. I don't know. I've been thinking a lot about that distinction, partly because, well, the writing I've been doing is so much about like the legacy of revolution and radicalism and trying to make things better, and how much I admire that and feel like how important that is in my family and more broadly. But also even in that, like that decision you're talking about to try to like make the world better in the rest of your time, not just be a good person, that can like rebound on the good person part in a really complicated way. You know, I've been writing a lot about being a parent and a revolutionary at the same time, being a son and a revolutionary at the same time, how you can kind of balance your commitment to not being an asshole, your commitment to like being decent to the people around you with your commitment to the larger world. And that's hard. I mean, I think it's hard for a lot of people.
Yeah, and I know you and in some of the conversations with your parents have basically just named it as a contradiction sometimes.
Yeah.
Like it may not be reconcilable.
Yeah.
And it also goes to show how not every decision that ends up hurting someone is because you're being an asshole.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah,
like there's
right.
all kinds of consequences. And so
Exactly.
I think, it's been really meaningful for others to see you wrestling through, as, in different forms now, the way these contradictions have showed up in your life, and it's resonated with people, even if they didn't share that exact specific lineage. But I'm wondering for you as a writer, you've clearly gotten comfortable, or at least willing, to talk about yourself and your life in these nuanced, very full, open ways. And I'm wondering if it took you a while while being a writer, to even be like, all right, now I'm ready to talk about my story.
Absolutely. It's so funny because I've been a like professional writer for almost 20 years now. It's a long time. And I never I never wrote in the first person. I never wrote as myself. I never wrote about my family until 5 years ago, until the pandemic, until I started working on that podcast and just kind of wrestling with my family story. And it was funny because my family story is so crazy that when, like when people knew me as a writer and then they'd find out my family story at like a dinner party or something, they'd be like, how are you not writing that.
Yeah,
like
yeah.
that's such a story. And I would just be like, I'm not, to write something well or to write it in a interesting way, to get interested yourself, you have to like have questions about it. You have to be wrestling with it, like you said. And I just never, I felt like I knew all that business about my family. I didn't really want to get into it publicly. I think partly it's about becoming a father and like trying to have those conversations with my kids and how I explain to them who their grandparents were, how I explain to them what my childhood was like. That makes you like think about it in a different way. And I think it's partly what's going on in the world. I grew up a kid of the 90s and 2000s, and I was a political person, but the culture was not there with like, it just the conversation about the movement, about radicalism, about revolution. It just was, it was a subterranean conversation, And so to have it burst out into a live conversation about how do we resist this government and everything, right as like my kids are becoming teenagers and thinking about how they want to make the world. I think it was that collision that made me want to engage that personal story.
This is a leading question, so feel free to either be led or not.
Yeah.
Was there any feeling of frustration or resentment of like, I've written all these other stories and I had to come home to this in order for it to like reverberate in all these ways?
I'll be led by that.
Thanks for
No, I don't feel resentment about it. I feel like you write long enough, you realize some stories that are really meaningful to you hit a zeitgeist and some don't. And some that you think, I'm just like, this was 3 months work and it's a little thing. And for whatever reason, it sparks something. So I've had that happen a couple times in my career, and just like, you don't ever know when it's going to happen. So
It's
I
like,
guess
be careful what you assign yourself.
Yeah, literally. And I knew when I talked about my family that I was writing into a larger conversation, that discourse has been happening. But I wasn't sure if what I had to say that I thought was new, whether that would spark a new conversation. So I thought as a writer, you're always just, what can you do except follow what you find interesting and follow what you think like you might want to say about something, and then see if the world is interested in that conversation.
I'm loving approaching the conversation from a point of craft.
Yeah.
Because Mother Country Radicals is like just one of the best podcasts I've ever heard.
Thank you.
I think one, just in how it's constructed, but two, like the story is something that like I personally invested in and care about. But now you're in the process of writing a book from that, and so I'm continuing that story. So I'm very interested, as you would see in the multimedia, how the same conversation or the same narrative can be structured in different formats. And so, what did you learn about your process as a writer for having to write that script, and what it means to be speaking it versus what it means now to be in the process of putting it into text, which is probably the more traditional way that the story would be told?
Yeah, no, I mean, I love talking about the craft, and I think, so I'm done with the book, and yeah, right on. Coming out next month.
It'll be out by the time this.
Word.
Yeah. No, it's there, and it's a thing. I have a copy of it at home.
And what's the title?
It's called Dangerous, Dirty, Violent, and Young,
Excellent.
A Fugitive Family in the Revolutionary Underground. And
I got to stop you right there. Wonderful title.
Thank you.
Talk about the choice to change the title.
Yeah. That comes from a Jefferson Airplane song that my parents and their friends in the radical undergrounds were obsessed with. And the lyric is something like, "We are all outlaws in the eyes of America. We are lawless, dangerous, dirty, violent, and young." And that was like graffiti in the 60s and 70s all over, because the idea was like, you do anything conscious and good and decent, you're an outlaw. You're a rock star, you're an outlaw. You're doing hip hop, you're an outlaw. Right. So the idea of like being in opposition to the culture. So yeah, the title comes from that idea of like my family being outlaws, and that weird contradiction in the lyric about dangerous, dirty, violent, and young. So, I was 4 or 5 years old growing up in the underground, and I knew our life.
You were the one who was young.
I was young. I was really young. They were all young. I mean, that's the crazy thing too, right? When you talk about the Weather Underground, when you talk about the Panthers, they were 16, 17, 18. The oldest of them was probably my mom, and she was like 25, 26. So it's like when, these are kids getting into this movement. So yeah, I was interested in that. But to answer your question about craft, the podcast for me, I'm a playwright first and foremost. That's where I came up, and so I like writing for multiple voices. I don't like writing in the first person, or it doesn't come naturally to me. So what I loved about the podcast is I spent a year and a half gathering these voices, interviewing my parents, interviewing Jamal Joseph, interviewing Sekou Odinga, interviewing Kakoya Shakur, and then to kind of put it together. It felt like I was putting a play together. It felt like I don't have to carry this with my own voice. I can bring in voices that will speak to something that I want to.
And you become
say.
like a weaver between
Exactly,
it, like
a weaver. But
yeah.
I'm very suspicious of writers who try to say this is what it all means. Let me tell you I really like that gesture of I'm talking about a subject. Let me have Jamal speak to it, and then let me have this FBI agent speak to it, and then I can try to say here's what I'm getting from that collision of voices. So that's where I came at it from. It's never done a podcast, don't know the form that well, but I know how to put together a conversation among different voices. And then, when I decided to write a book, it really came out of, so the podcast came out. I was very happy with it. It started a bunch of conversations that I was excited to have. And then a couple weird things happened. One thing was I'd been fighting with the FBI for 6 years to try to get my mom's files. And we'd filed multiple Freedom of Information Act requests, and we got stonewalled, and they would,
They weren't willing partners?
They weren't willing partners. Yeah, the CIA just
It's
said...
you guys are part of the story. Don't you want to be in the podcast?
Yeah, I got this hilarious letter from the CIA because, my mom was very much on the radar of the FBI. J. Edgar Hoover called her the most dangerous woman in America. She was also on the radar of the CIA. She went to Cuba, met in Havana with the Vietnamese military, with the Cuban government. And so the CIA was very concerned that she was creating some kind of international revolutionary movement.
They're not fond of that.
Yeah, but when I filed this Freedom of Information Act request to the CIA, I got this hilarious letter saying, we don't have any files on Bernardine Dohrn, and if we did, we wouldn't tell you because they would be classified.
They're just 16-year-olds.
The FBI took the opposite tack. They said, there's so many files, we can't give them to you. You're going to have to narrow your request. There's thousands of boxes of files. Wow. So I was like, all right, well, give me the ones from 1970 to 1980. They're like, there's still too many. So it was that kind of process. But anyway, I wanted to get the files while I was making the podcast. Didn't get them. Podcast came out, and 6 months later, I got a letter saying, here's a thumb drive with 7,000 pages of documents about your mom. That was one thing that happened. And then the second thing that happened is a lot of people who listened to the podcast reached out being like, there's things you didn't talk about that you might not know about that I could tell you about. And so I felt like there was more to say. I got a box from an old friend of the family with hundreds of letters that my mom had written from underground to this woman, which is crazy because, in my family, my mom burned all the letters we got. We didn't keep anything. I have a few family photos from my childhood, but basically documentation is sparse from when we were underground. But once I had these letters, I started reading my mom's old letters. I asked permission first, and it just opened up this whole more personal side of the story, and it brought back memories for me of what it was like driving around in the underground, and what it was like growing up, and what it was like when my mom went to prison. So the book is an attempt to synthesize all that and to answer some questions that came up from the making of the podcast. And I'm still, the first person stuff is not my favorite of writing as me. But the book has a lot of documents, a lot of letters, a lot of voices, a lot of new interviews where I'm trying to get at what really happened and how it can be useful for all of us today.
What were some of those questions that came up sifting through those files, sifting through those letters?
Well, some of it was just the FBI didn't always know where we were or what was going on, but what they did know raised questions for me about wait, where were we when I was 3 years old? And why was I always told it was here, but it's pretty clear that it must have been there because they had people meeting us in various places and in retrospect, after the fact, they would be like, Bernardine Dohrn was spotted here. And I started to just try to put together a timeline, how did this work? Where were we?
It's true. Most people, when their childhood memories get foggy, they don't have like
Exactly.
very well documented.
Yeah, so that's the thing. It's like
State
my
files.
my memories are foggy, but like I had thousands and thousands of pages from both sides, the FBI files and from my mom's letters and from photographs that family friends gave me and stuff like that. So I just tried to piece together like what was happening, how did I fit into it all?
Yeah.
And you know, one of the things I find, and I talk a lot about this in the book, is you know, in my family, the story had always been, yes, we were outlaws. Yes, we were fugitives. Yes, we were revolutionaries. Yes, mom was on the FBI's 10 most wanted list. But like we were parents first. We were, by the time we had you, we had stopped the revolutionary actions. We were still committed to the cause, but we decided to have a family. And that's what happened. I think a lot of kids have that story in their family that they like changed things, you know, like we were this and then you came along and we did this. But going through all these files, I just kind of started to figure out like that can't be right. There's stuff going on when I was still a little kid that I couldn't have known about at the time, but that was very clear from just the like roadmap of our journey across the country. We were connected to parts of the movement that I had never understood before. So the book, in a way, is like uncovering that mystery or trying to figure it out.
Did that feel illuminating to find? Did it feel like a betrayal to find?
a little of both. I don't know if I'd say a betrayal, but it felt like, okay, wait a second. Like my parents, who are always so open and so generous about sharing their stories, there's things they haven't told me. And of course, again, that's always, all parents have things they haven't told their kids. We can't tell our kids everything, right? But yeah, I did think, wow, I made a 10-hour podcast about this story and there's whole chunks that I missed.
Yeah.
And that was like just a feeling of, there's more to it and I could dig deeper here. So that was one part of it. And then the other part of it, as a writer, you're just thinking, oh, there's something cool here. Like there's you know, putting aside as a son, just as a writer, I was like, wow, there's a whole story that like is so hidden that it must be interesting.
You're speaking to this like learning journey that I'm really curious about. Of like, I can imagine, right? There were things that were knowledge or understood going into the project, right? You said like my whole life, I'm the child of these revolutionaries. And then you start doing like formal research. And so I'm sure that like shifted and changed your knowledge and understanding of not just your experience, but this historical phenomenon, right? Like this is mom and dad, but like they are globally important in my eyes. And then you put it out. Right, you're doing talks, people are responding, there's more learning, and now you're in this like going further in depth in the book process. Just like a kind
with
of
the playmaking in the middle.
Yeah.
It's really wonderful.
Just kind of maybe a softball question of it, of like taking out the personal family mom and dad aspect of it. You're now like an expert, a researched expert of this subject. What's like the most incredible part of the legacy or part of the work of we can, you know, reduce it to Weatherman Underground, but maybe this like larger movement contingency that was above and underground.
Makes you go, whoa.
No, it's great. I think for me, the biggest like takeaway of the importance of the legacy probably has to do with these connections between people and groups that I had never understood were connected. You know, I think in American history, even if you're studying American radicalism, you tend to get like, here's the story of the Panthers, and here's the story of Martin Luther King, and here's the story of Fred Hampton, and you know, and it's and maybe you study the Weather Underground or SDS or whatever, and so you have this idea of like, okay, the 60s and 70s was an era of activism, an era even of revolutionary struggle, but you have to dig a little deeper, and you start to see the whole thing was connected. It was people were working together, interracial coalitions that I'd never known about, even though I'm this close to the story. You know, I never knew that my mom and SDS were part of Fred Hampton's Rainbow Coalition. I never knew that after my parents went underground, they were working with Eldridge Cleaver and connected to the Algerian resistance and the International Black Panther Party. And certainly before I wrote the book, I didn't know the connections to Assata Shakur and the Black Liberation Army. And so for me, that idea of like, the book, in a way, is just charting my mom's journey of radicalization and then my own journey as a kid, and those two parallel stories. But my mom's journey can really be mapped by like, she's a suburban white girl growing up in Wisconsin, goes to law school, wants to make a difference, but doesn't know how. And then Dr. King shows up in Chicago to lead the rent strike. So she joins the civil rights movement, follows Dr. King for a while, and then he's murdered. And then she's looking around like, what do I do? Joins SDS, winds up in Chicago, meets Fred Hampton, gets inspired by him, joins the Rainbow Coalition. So now there's this new coalition. And then he's murdered, you know? And then she goes underground, meets up with Eldridge Cleaver and the Black Liberation Army. Many of them are killed or exiled or arrested. And then Assata Shakur is arrested, and the Weather Underground does what they can to try to help get her out. And then she, you know, does escape and it ends up living in Cuba for the rest of her life.
But power.
Yeah, but all these kind of stories of it's like the whole journey has to be mapped by these moments of trying to build radical coalitions and then having the government or racist vigilantes kill people, and that being each stage of the struggle was punctuated by these kind of episodes of violence. So for me, that was really eye-opening to see that you read about the Panthers and it often feels like they were an island unto themselves, but actually they were always trying to make connections, always trying to like work with other groups, and the government was determined to prevent those coalitions from forming, determined to the point of violence and murder multiple times. Yeah. And so, yeah, for me, that was eye-opening, that my parents were part of that struggle and that they were connected to all these larger movements.
Yeah, it's very, this feels like flattening it, but very like Forrest Gumpy, right?
Yeah.
Like,
like Zelig, like popping up.
Like I obviously know all those historical beats. I know of the King assassination, but like hearing you just right now, even after hearing the podcast, but hearing you say it, that like she saw him speak and then he was murdered. She saw him like both the most magnetic, personable orators in American history.
Right.
And then to like be personally affected by not just politically, like, oh, this is wrong, or oh, now the kind of history book of like, oh, now we need to go further to the left, but like trauma actually.
Right. Exactly right. I mean, when people ask me now, like, why did your mom get radicalized? I wrote a whole book about it, so I could be like, read the book. But if you want to boil it down, the two seminal events in that journey were King's murder and Fred Hampton's murder. And, you know, here's a young woman who's trying to like learn about the movement, trying to learn about racism and her own part in that and how she can be a comrade in that struggle. And both of her mentors are killed violently. And so, yeah, that's what drove these people over the edge of like, we have to do more. We have to work harder.
It leads to something that we've, in smaller way or less newsworthy ways, spent a lot of time thinking about, which is how much of movement work is grief work. And it's not always, I think, the most clearly that for people, including the people in it. Yeah. And sometimes it's not necessarily the most healing grief work, right? Like there might be ways to do that would actually move them through to a different place. Yeah. But yeah, I think sometimes we oversell how much of it is outrage and undersell how much of it is grief.
That's really interesting. I hadn't thought of it that way, but I do write a lot about how grief and rage are really two parts of the same gesture. You know, that grief really did, for my mom at least, you know, there's this famous clip of her speaking to reporters after Fred Hampton's murder, and she's talking about how outrageous it is that people in Chicago, it's Christmas time, right? Hampton was killed in December. And she says, you know, for people in this city to be going about their business and ringing bells and opening presents after the murder of a black leader here in this city is an outrage, you know, and you can hear in her voice this sort of like sense of it can't go on like this. Like we can't just be part of this. And so, yeah. So
I'm curious to that because we have our analogs to that of like, how can people be ringing bells and going on vacation and doing that in this moment? And yet here we are. And it's something I've spent a lot more time thinking about because it does feel acute and close to home of like what it means to live in a state of destabilization and collapse and have to move through the day and hold to the rhythms of life and not let those be destabilized and collapsed. And I think people do that in different ways, but I think especially I hear parents talk about that. And so I'm wondering, how, one, from what you have learned and observed and experienced from them, but maybe more acutely for you, how do you think about that role and relationship of, it's not just about keeping your kids safe, but it's about keeping some sense of like consistency in life in a time of destabilization.
Yeah, I'm glad you went. That was exactly where I was going to go with this, because I think, we all, I think in our little bubble, we all have this feeling of like, how can we just go on with the rhythms of life? But when you have kids, the rhythms of life are pressing. They're all around you. You can't opt out of those rhythms. And so it is, again, a contradiction. And yet, like, one thing I came to writing the book is because I was thinking a lot about my own parents who, when they were young, like when my mom said that about Fred Hampton, she's 26, 27, and, there's nobody really her parents were in the picture, and they were very hurt by her decision to dedicate her life to, fighting the government, to going underground and everything. But that was kind of it. It was like it was her and her young friends being like, we're gonna fight the government, and at all costs, we're gonna give up everything and do this. 10 years later, when she had me, that equation is different. The society was different, and the equation is different. It's like, you can't just say, well, we have to do something. We can't just go on with our life, because you are going on with your life. You have your kid at home. At the same time, I came to realize, writing the book, that for her and for many of her friends, for my adopted brother's parents, that we talk about it as a contradiction, but for them, it was less of a contradiction and more like two sides of the same coin. You have kids and you want to raise them and be a part of the rhythm of their lives and raise them to be good adults. But if you think that your society is so profoundly damaged and diseased that they're going to grow up into a world that is unhealthy and dangerous and unjust, then you also have to be committed to like changing that world for them, right? So I think for my parents and their friends, it became this thing of like, yes, we want our kids to be safe, and if we just stand by and raise them, they're going to grow up into a nightmare. So how do we like balance that sense of like keeping them safe while in an unsafe world, and
while also trying to make a safe world at the same
yeah,
time.
honestly, my favorite quote about this that I found that I use in the book is Asada Shakur talking about having a child in prison, right? Because she was at Rikers Island, locked up in the psycho ward in solitary confinement, and she was pregnant. And she talks about, and she got pregnant in prison, and she was with a co-defendant,
And like names it as an act of resistance.
Exactly. But she says this very profound thing about like, we thought a lot about how can you have a children? This world is a terrible, terrible world. How can you bring children into this world? And then she says, and then I thought about my grandmother and my great-great-grandmother, my great-great-great-grandmother, and they brought children into this world. So how do you do that while knowing how profoundly awful the world can be, especially for your own children? And she says something like, we decided we were going to live. There's no choice but to live, even in oppression, So I don't know. I find that deep, even in my own life. I'm not in Rikers Island, and I'm not a full-time revolutionary the way she was. But when you decide to have kids, and if you have your eyes open to what the world is like, you're both, it's a hopeful gesture, maybe a naively optimistic gesture, but it's also a gesture of like, I'm committed to raising them, and I have to be committed to trying to make the world a little bit better, because I don't want them to have to inherit this.
I hope this section is helpful for people. You name yourself now as a full-time revolutionary, and that leads to this curiosity I have.
You're you get like 1099.
Not
a W-2.
Not full-time.
I'm curious your perspective, because I think you and your parents both model the antithesis to like ideological arrogance or this like movement or liberatory idea of like being the expert. Right. And like, people usually push back with like, well, you're only expert your own experience. Was like, well, our experience was the shit, what I'm saying? Like I, as somebody who's like, I've had to push back against this notion of like, I know it all. Not like it's been a struggle, but like I read the books about this 10 to 20 year period that was your family's experience. And now that you've researched and wrote a book about, but it's like, oh, we all are coming to it. There's so much knowledge. Like you gotta, not act like there is a purity of I know because I've studied more, even though you may have more information. But where I struggle with that, so my dad is prominent and different. My dad's a comedian. And so when people talk about comedy, that's where I am arrogant. You know what I'm saying? Like, no, I grew up in this shit. I know
he's
what it
playing
is.
the comedy underground.
You know?
Right.
And so I'm saying this jokingly of like people, read a few tweets now, but it used to be read a few books and you feel like you know everything about the 60s, 70s. And therefore I could lead the way of how this strategy is supposed to go.
Yeah.
And so how do you, as you named this time, this last 6 to 10 years, there's been this need / emergence of a radical alternative to how we address our social and political realities. How do you show up to this moment, not as an arrogant or not prescriptive of like, because I've studied this and I'm born into this, this is how we should approach it. You move with a humility that I'm curious about.
I hope so. I don't even think I have to work hard at it because I really don't feel like I know the answers to these questions. I mean, I know my family story and I know it better than I knew it before. But even that story is so full of ambiguity and ambivalence and contradictions. So you come to it being
Marvin
like,
Gaye's kids think they know everything about music.
Right. Yeah,
They know what's going on.
Yeah, but like, how do you, I mean, anytime you're writing about something, whether it's a novel, a play, or a history like this, you are telling a story that you hope has resonance. But if you try to be prescriptive about like, okay, what it adds up to is this answer, you're going to fail your audience or your reader because they're coming to you with their own questions and their own experience that's different from yours. So, I mean, I think James Baldwin talks about like, you don't write, the difference between a preacher, he says, and a novelist or a writer is like the preacher comes with the answer and tries to give you that answer. There might be preachers who would quibble with that idea, but like
He might have been talking about his dad.
he might have been, yeah. But he's kind of
He's
saying
doing his own parental work through,
right. He is, yes, exactly right. But like, if you come with the word and you're like, here's the word, that's a certain kind of gesture, and some people might find that useful. But for Baldwin, he's saying the artist has to come with questions, has to come with like, I'm not sure, I'm wrestling with it too. Human questions are irresolvable on some level. And I think my parents' story, my family story, it's like it has an interest for our time. To me, what's interesting about it, what's useful for it in our time, is they had a certainty that was both galvanizing. It helped them act in a way that I think most people were unwilling to act, and it led them down paths that were dangerous and unproductive at times. So, you have to sort of undercut that certainty. I think my parents in their later life were very suspicious themselves of the certainty that they had in their 20s,
How do you relate with that certainty? One, when you see it in the reverberations of who they were, but also when you see it in other people now.
Yeah.
How does that skepticism move into like protectiveness?
It's funny. It's complicated for me. I admire certainty, but I almost never have it myself. I feel like I have a different role, and it's partly a chosen role, and it's partly characterological. Like I grew up distrusting that kind of certainty, maybe just because of the experience I had as a kid, and so, But when I see it in people, when I see heroes of the struggle who can kind of, you have to believe in something strongly to risk yourself, to risk your family, to act. And my parents really had that at a certain moment in their lives in a way that I think was not only inspirational to a lot of people, but became symbolic to a lot of people. I think the reason the story of the Weather Underground endures as a symbol is because it represents this idea of like, white people in America fighting back. And that just doesn't happen very often. Yeah. You really have to like struggle through history to find examples of people willing to risk it all in the struggle for Black liberation. White people in particular, just doesn't happen. So people look at that, and even if they can't conjure that certainty themselves, it means something to see what that looks like.
Yeah, it was striking. Sorry, Dave.
No, go ahead.
In so many of the stories, one on the podcast, but also even in the piece that was in the New Yorker that's pulled from the book, the like tactical conceit of 90% of these plans is like, it's based on the like invisible threat, or it's based on the like assumed invisibility that a white person doing something will
you're
have.
talking about the white edge.
Right, which is like in some ways, it's actually like the flip side of like Spook Who Sat by the Door is like, in that the story is like, well, as long as this black character is in these roles of, emptying the garbage
Non-threatening
can, can move
service.
throughout. But there's this flip side that, I hear in many of the stories that you tell of like, well, especially like a white person with a kid will just be perceived as not a threat.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if that was as true as they thought it was, and whether, this is not a question I expect you to have the answer to, whether that's still the invisibility of that threat is as absolute as maybe sometimes people thought it was then.
Yeah. Well, can I explain a little bit about
Sure,
what the
yeah,
white
yeah.
edge is? Because people might not know. But yes, a lot of the tactics of the Weather Underground, especially later when they were underground with black comrades like the Black Liberation Army and others, had to do with how can we weaponize our whiteness? How can we use our whiteness to aid, comrades who are engaged in revolutionary action? So the way that looked was okay, if you're in the Black Underground, it might be really hard to get a new ID or to get a lease for an apartment or to get a car without attracting suspicion, because black people are naturally looked at with suspicion in this culture. So white people would volunteer their whiteness, their privilege, to be like, well, we can help get those things. Or, and it culminated in the late 70s and early 80s in if there are actions, expropriations, bank robberies, kidnappings, prison breaks, where those are carried out by black militant soldiers, people in the underground, but then white people are driving the getaway cars, police are not going to suspect this because it's almost inconceivable, the idea of an interracial radical coalition. I think in a lot of ways that was a powerful idea. It also, of course, has its own privilege that's really difficult. I mean, I talk in the podcast about my mom getting pulled over when we were underground, and she was a most wanted fugitive, and the cop came to the window and she was shaking with fear, and he reached into the car and put his hand on her hand and said, "You don't have to be afraid of us. What's going on? Are you okay?" And then he let her go, right? And Assata Shakur was pulled over, and it ended in a firefight, and people were killed, and so that privilege just inherent, the idea of being pulled over, even if you're a most wanted fugitive, whiteness is a shield and a protection. So I think that's a really interesting insight. And I talked to a lot of members of the Black Underground who really credit the Weather Underground with being there to when they disappeared, when they went underground. Jamal Joseph says in the book, that was one of the things that they could do for us is help with ID, help with safe houses, help with cars. And he says they were our Underground Railroad, to be real clear. And that's pretty amazing, Yeah. And then on the other hand, there's this other side to it, which I also talk about in the book, which is that in the long run, the Black Underground got, the members of those groups got violently suppressed in a way that even the Weather Underground, with all their violence and notoriety, were able to assimilate back into the world. So that whiteness can't, even lending it to the struggle, even using it in actions of revolutionary solidarity, it never goes away.
There was still an exit ramp back into above ground life.
There's so many different places I want to go, but now I want to hone in on this. This is exciting. So I'm curious for you, what is the most valuable way we in this current time can talk about the intense and extreme tactics that historically emerged for the underground, for Oh man! So in being honest, there's a respect with your parents of trying not to Bill is silly. He'll say some shit, but try not to be too voyeuristic about it, and know that there's also sensitivity and trauma enveloped in that. I stole your enveloped. You said enveloped earlier. I got stuck in my brain.
We're sorting envelopes here.
And then there's very much these poles of, the kind of online lefty romanticizing of and then there's the mainstream, these are terroristic acts of a forgotten time that shouldn't be thought of seriously. And so for you now that have studied this and then live with the legacy of it, what conversation should people be having about those tactics?
Oh, you guys are not being easy.
No, we care for your parents.
And I want to give the caveat of also having the conversation out loud, as I'm kind of asking you to do, can bring on risk and danger.
Yeah,
and so
yeah.
like the care of how
No,
we
I appreciate that. I mean, it's funny because having written this whole book, you always have the instinct to be like, I wrote about this in the book. I had spent chapters on this question because it is a complicated and important question. I guess my feeling about it is violence in the movement. There's a long history, and we could go back to slave rebellions and John Brown and indigenous uprisings and slave uprisings and so on, and so I'm not against those tactics if they are necessary. And I think we have to reckon with the fact that, generally speaking, in American society, in a democracy, however imperfect, acts of violence have usually brought reprisals that are that make that and alienated allies that make that violence usually counterproductive. Not always, but usually. I think
So not even as a values judgment, just as a tactical
as
choice.
a tactical question. As a moral judgment, I think there are moral lines that we who are decent, good people should really respect, even in the emergency of a radical movement. That is to say, I think threatening and hurting innocent people, children, families, civilians, is morally wrong. And so, there are complicated questions there. When you get into things like John Brown, when you get into Nat Turner's uprisings, where do we draw lines of saying this is a violent emergency, we are being suppressed violently, we need to respond violently? I understand that. But I think if people in the movement today get to romanticizing that and thinking we don't have to respect those lines because they don't respect those lines, I think that is profoundly dangerous, tactically and morally. I think also it's worth saying that a broad-based movement has to push forward in a broad way, and that is going to mean voting, registration drives and organizing and culture and art and all these things, and it's going to mean militancy. How you define that militancy, I really do think is site-specific. I think you have to think about context, you have to think about morality, you have to think about, are there better alternatives, all those things.
That's really interesting, the distinction between militancy and violence. I don't have a question. I'm wrestling
well, I use
with
the
that.
word intentionally because I think action is important. And we talked about earlier, one of the things I admire about people who have that kind of certainty to act and not just to talk about what they're seeing. I'm a writer. My instinct and my character goes towards let me wrestle with the questions. But if it's all that, then nothing happens.
Right.
I do think you need people wrestling with the questions. I think a movement can't survive or can't do anything good without really figuring out what it's for and what it means in a complicated way. But yeah, you need militants. Militants don't have to have guns necessarily. They can act militantly as part of a broader based thing. And I think you see examples of that. You see examples of that in Black Lives Matter. You see examples of that in the environmental movement and so on.
Do you ever worry about, it's another leading question, your nuance around this question fueling the dismissal of certain tactics or also the dismissal of your position, how it could be read?
I think about it. I don't exactly worry about it. I think about it, and I do think it's always a danger of trying to be complicated when the world is on fire, Right. But I also think movements, leftist movements, radical movements, have gotten themselves in trouble before, and will again, by saying, no, the emergency is so dire, we have to push forward without nuance. I think that you get into dangerous territory, again, morally and tactically. You alienate your natural allies if you start to be we know the right answer, nobody else knows, and we're going to be, certain about it. And I mean, it's funny. I do think about this in our current media moment where nuance is always lost. When the New Yorker piece I just wrote, when it shows up on social media, everybody's boiling it down to one or two sentences. Right?
What's the thing that you've seen?
So I wrote 6,000 words for that piece on the complexity of growing up in a violent radical movement in a family that who were fugitives. And I tried to be as honest as I could and as radical as I could, but also as nuanced as I could. And when it shows up on social media, it's usually either right-wingers saying, look, this child of terrorists is justifying his parents, blah, blah, blah. Or it can be people on the left saying, why is he, why is this son of revolutionaries not, why is he criticizing the revolution? What can you do about that? I'm not sure. I'm not sure. Like I'm not gonna boil down my whole life and my whole experience and my whole understanding of the world so that it can be digested on Twitter or X or whatever the hell.
It's also part of I'd imagine, the risk or the vulnerability that comes from writing about your own life, whether it's in this context or it's like people are not going to make room for your whole life.
For sure. And when it's a political story, of course, people are going to weaponize it for their own partisan needs, right? Not nobody. There are people who are interested in the human story of it and the human messiness of it. But a lot of people just they digest all media these days to make the point that they want to make.
Yeah.
And they'll just, if it can't be weaponized for their agenda, they'll discard it. But I don't know. As a writer, what are you going to do about that? I always
keep writing.
Yeah, totally. I had this experience when I was a graduate student in playwriting. Edward Albee, the great playwright, came and spoke to us, and he was a brilliant writer and a kind of a cantankerous old man by this point. And somebody asked him, "What does Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf mean?" This was his great masterpiece of a play. What were you trying to say? And again, he's a grumpy dude, and he said something like, "If I could tell you what it meant, I would just write it on a napkin and hand it to you." I wrote a play because that's what it means. It means the whole thing. You have to read the play or see the play to know what I was trying to say. And I think that's deep, because it is if you're going to write a book or a podcast or a play, you're trying to say something more complicated than can be said in 140 characters or whatever else.
It's not just a what, it's
exactly. It's not a slogan. I don't write slogans. I can't write slogans, and I'm trying to write a story. And to get the meaning of a story, you have to experience the story.
So, you talked about the white edge a little bit, and you're talking about how people reduce things on Twitter, which is bringing me to this popular collective imagination. Which now I want to ask you a question we asked your dad.
Sorry.
The Weather Underground has existed in the pop culture imagination, and I see it get referenced, and as the childhood references that I didn't know what it mean, but I see now it's the Leonardo meme of oh man, I know I know those guys. And so we have this moment now of One Battle After Another, winning the Oscar. And like I said to him, immediately it didn't take much, for those who are just pop culture commentators to say, oh, this is an allegory of a modern day Weather Underground. That was just accepted as fact. And so we don't just have to talk about the film, but I am curious your thoughts on it. But I'm the larger pop culture collective imagination that this legacy sits in, that you're bringing history and truth and firsthand account to. How do you see it? How do you understand it? And how does it play into what you want to contribute?
What gets left out of that understanding?
Totally. So, first of all, as for One Battle After Another, I really loved it, but it's complicated, and I know a lot of people on the left felt mixed about it, but I there's a lot of things I think to admire about it. I think you guys asked me about that where the title came from, and I did finally find it. I wrote about it in the New Yorker piece, that title came from a statement that my parents, the Weather Underground, wrote after the Days of Rage, where they said, from here on in, it's one battle after another, with white youth joining the fight and taking it to the streets, right?
Oh, so we were doing some AirGo fact checking. We tapped in the expert here. I forgot about that.
Exactly, yeah. So, and you guys spurred me to kind of go and find it. I couldn't find it in time for you, but I did find it.
Well, you have found it in time for us. Here we go.
And so, it was this kind of, so clearly, Paul Thomas Anderson and that team was drawing from that story. And I think they've talked in interviews, Leonardo has talked about drawing on the Weather Underground. Tiana Taylor has talked about Asada Shakur as a model for that character in the film. Obviously, it's not literally the Weather Underground. They very consciously took that vibe, I guess, and imported it to the present day and wanted to talk about it in terms of immigration, but it's still that, I mean, to me, what they got right, and this is interesting, or what they got right from my point of view is twofold. One is this question of interracial radical solidarity, which you just don't see very much. Even in previous treatments of the Weather Underground, it was usually, running on empty or something. It was like the Hollywoodization of it was always like white hippie radicals, underground, but the black story left out of it. And I just don't think you can tell the story accurately without that. The other thing I liked about it, and of course this is my own personal obsession, preoccupation, is the generational question, right? Of like, thinking of the Weather Underground or just of like aging radicals as important in their own right, and their story being like fundamentally an American story and a story of like resistance against oppression and fascism and all these things, but ultimately about like, what are we going to do? What are we passing on to the next generation? So I really, I loved him ending the movie with the daughter kind of going off to the protest and being like, and the dad saying, be careful, and her saying, I won't. I relate to that as a dad. I relate to it as a son. I think there's something right about all that. In terms of the larger question about like the Weather Underground's place in pop culture and in history, it is just funny. Like I write about this in the book, but from the very first moment, there was something about the group, and in particular about my mom, that struck a like symbolic, iconic chord for people. Like when you step back, when I was writing the book, I'm doing all this research, reading all these treatments about her, and you step back and you think like the government treated them like they were this existential threat.
This betrayal.
Yeah, well, exactly, a betrayal. And the existential threat part doesn't make all that much sense. Like J. Edgar Hoover is calling my mom the most dangerous woman in America. Richard Nixon is saying there are thousands of people, mostly under 30, who are committed to tearing down this country by any means necessary. We have to do everything we can to stop them. They're saying this when the Weather Underground has set off one bomb in a police station. So it wasn't the threat in a tactical or military sense that was freaking people out. It was something about the symbolic and iconic resonance of it. And to me, that's pretty simple. It's that my mom came to represent, before Patty Hearst, but Patty Hearst ended up representing it too, this sort of Freudian nightmare of like our own daughters are like pretty suburban, well-bred white girls turning against us and like wanting to tear down their own country.
Which is like deeply messaged resonance in the midst of anti-ICE action. I mean, the Renee Good killing, like it's something we actually were talking about. Like, of course there is this attack and dismissal of black and brown action. But the vitriol feels strong in this way in relation to the, like, the way liberal women, white women were being discussed. That was a very, I have understood it historically, but I was like, oh, this is like an anger or a spitting almost on the right talking about this. That's different from just categorical dehumanization.
Absolutely right. It's an intimate betrayal, and it's a feeling of hating their own shadow, and it's a feeling of like our own people. Which of course my parents would never accept that characterization. Of themselves as part of American whiteness or whatever. But I think for a whole generation and a whole sector of American society, it was like, middle-class white kids should not be taking part in this rebellion. And I will say too, we were talking earlier about the kind of partisan nature of response to this kind of thing. I think there's been this active attempt to undercut the reputation of the Weather Underground. You'll often hear people talking online and whatever about it as like a bunch of privileged white kids. And just that one rhetorical gesture is enough to say, so it couldn't be real. It couldn't be, it can be dismissed. They were just spoiled kids acting out against dad or whatever. And there's a number of things wrong with that. First of all, they weren't all privileged white kids. If you scratch the surface of it, some of them, my father grew up in privilege, but my mother didn't really. She grew up in a lower middle class household, but many members of the Weather Underground were working class or the children of communists, Jewish communists in New York. So it was actually a fairly like diverse in terms of its class orientation. So by characterizing it that way, what they're trying to do is to say, okay, black people can fight for their own liberation, but as soon as white people do it, it's just play acting, cosplay, whatever. And I mean, it's a fair criticism. You can certainly argue about who should, take up the mantle of the struggle,
or at
symbolize
least take
the
up
struggle.
the spotlight. Yeah.
Exactly, absolutely. But in terms of what they were doing, I think almost every action that the Weather Underground undertook was both explicitly and implicitly credited to black leaders who had inspired them and an attempt to support black leadership in the struggle. So I don't know. I think the symbolic resonance is clearly complicated for everybody. But to me, on the right, it means these people betrayed us. On the left, it means, wow, those people did something that I kind of almost wish I could have done, or there's a wish fulfillment aspect to that myth too.
There's this way you just talked about, the state kind of early on projecting out the danger that's actually beyond the capacity of the group, but they needed this avatar of fear. And that makes me think of two things. One, just how there's this thread of pushing the fear even before it's a real problem. So Michelle Alexander in The New Jim Crow documents how there were so many news stories about the crack monster before it was actually in neighborhoods in the way that it was. And they actually created the premise of the crack era
100%.
Before crack was on the streets.
That
then allowed for the swift carceral response to it. And then I'm thinking of another a professor we had, Shannon Benjamin. She kind of one day, I forgot what we were reading, but just the articulation of white supremacy. It may not be what it's all boiled down to, but how it understands itself is as patriarchal white supremacy, as this protection of white femininity, right? So this whole idea of they're gonna come for us. It's when you narrow it down, it's the horde, the savage, the Negro is gonna come for our wives and our daughters.
100%.
And so the idea of your mother then as this emblem of of rejecting the whole house of cards, and that being such an affront, and then striking this fear chord, it makes me just want to honor her a little bit more. And obviously your whole work is doing that, but with both of them, but with her specifically, there is this the most dangerous woman in America, replacing Angela on the FBI 10 Most Wanted, and how tantalizing that is. But even after being incarcerated, after being underground, coming home, and the work that they've done that is less sexy, less grabby, less headliney, but has been decades of sustained showing up, being a part of every committee, be it at every rally. How do you see the overground legacy of your mother and your parents as they have aged into this beautiful presence?
Yeah. Wow. Well, you said a lot of things I want to pick up on, but in terms of that last question, I mean, one of the things that's fascinating about the whole movement, not just my parents, but almost every member of the Weather Underground who survived, and every member of the Black Panther Party who survived, whom I know personally, they all went on to do decades and decades of above ground work. Some of them became writers, some of them became teachers, some of them became activists, but in almost no cases, and there's a couple of famous cases of people turning to the right or whatever, but 90% of the time, these people, after enduring unimaginable loss and tragedy and all these things, committed themselves to decades of work, to continue to change the world in small and incremental ways. And I think it's a really interesting lesson. Most of us wouldn't want our 25-year-old selves sort of encased in amber and then come to represent our entire lives. I think my parents, if you look at the full arc, they have been movement activists for 65 years now, or whatever you want to say, and that in of itself is impressive. In terms of the patriarchal, I think you're exactly right about how white supremacy functions, and I do think a number of women, Angela Davis first, then Bernardine Dohrn, then Assata Shakur, they were the subject of this kind of lurid fascination to the FBI and to the media, and it had to do with this kind of these beautiful female militants. Like, what does that mean?
Yeah.
That these people who we all consider attractive could also be carrying guns and setting off bombs. And that became a kind of a real symbolic resonance. I mean, Assata Shakur was an incredible organizer and an activist in her own right, but like with my mom, the attention paid to her was disproportionate to the work she was doing. She became symbolic of something larger. You know?
Not to go too far down the one battle, but it's where the sexualization within one battle after another, if you understand it through that lens of like, this was how they were being seen.
Absolutely.
It's very different.
Absolutely. And I think Lockjaw's kind of like fetishization is clearly part of what the movie is trying
There is something
to get
even
at.
even if it's something clunky or uncomfortable about
Absolutely.
it. There is something honest to it at its core.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm not defending every gesture in the film, but I think there's truth to that idea of like the hypersexualization, you know.
Because it made me uncomfortable.
Yeah, totally. But, you know, it's funny. I mean, with my mom, obviously the racial element doesn't exist, but there's this, every quote I read about her, I did this, you know, excavation of all the history. And like I quote in the book, for example, there's this moment that's become very key in people's understanding of her, where she gives a speech at the Flint War Council in 1969. And it's a very radical speech about, you know, no more talking. Now it's time for action. We got to join the Panthers and the fight for liberation and go underground and blah, blah, blah. But the FBI informants who were there in disguise at Flint, when they write about it and talk about it in the FBI files and then later in their own memoirs and stuff, it's all about how she's not wearing a bra and she's sexually appealing, even though the things she's saying are insane. And so you can feel them like having this weird dissonance, you know, this strange.
What's up with this chick?
Yeah.
But also,
wait,
this
she's
is
pretty.
This is maybe part of why sometimes people don't write their own family history. So you got to sit and read all these dudes over here.
Well,
Talk about your mom's hot.
Yeah, totally. And I, you know,
But not to make light of it. It's also vile. And
No, I can make light of it. I
Reduction.
mean, I definitely, as the son writing it, there were moments when I was like, I think I'll avoid this trajectory of the personal story. But and you know, I mean, to be fair, my mom and Angela and Assata, not only beautiful, but also like projecting a kind of like, you know, they were all very stylish, image conscious people, and they used their symbolic resonance to their own benefit, as they should, you know.
Totally.
But yeah, the reaction to them, I think you're right that there's this kind of visceral both attraction and disgust at women having that level of agency. Yeah.
What was the thing that you said? I had a thought. I'm trying to.
Bridget.
In addition to this, like patriarchal question within white supremacy.
The fear, like the casting out the fear before it's realized. So like the crack epidemic and like them naming that they're building up the Weather Underground beyond what they are because like fear is what's needed.
Fear.
Yes.
So as we move toward rapping, I'm thinking about the, you know, present resonances of like, what are those existential fears of power that are being projected onto us? And in some ways, like often we have to then deal with the consequences of being perceived as having a power that we actually haven't built yet. And so I'm thinking about the encampments as an example of that. I'm thinking about, I mean, it often gets put on young people. And so that was the closest example of like, if these young people get together and build these on these campuses, the symbolic power of that undermines so much because they're these privileged young people.
Completely agree. And I'll give two examples. The encampments are a great example, and the stuff about Antifa right now is an interesting example because you see the government obsession with them is so disproportionate to what Antifa is as a movement, right? And you have all these like Justice Department officials being detailed to the Antifa like mission or whatever. It's insane. But that's exactly what happened with the Weather Underground. Is like suddenly the vast majority of FBI agents involved in counterterrorism and political radicalism were detailed to the Weather Underground, which was a group of 100 kids. Right. It didn't make any sense. And yet it also, and at the same time, talk about the encampments, I write about this in the book, but in the mid-1960s, the freak out about campus organizing was like substantially beyond anything we're seeing even today. Like the government in state houses around the country, they passed dozens of laws criminalizing campus protest. In West Virginia, I think they passed a law saying police could kill protesters on campus without consequence if they were, disobeying the rules of their university. So it got to that extent of like, this is an existential threat to our society that these college students, our own sons and daughters, are out there protesting. This was against the Vietnam War, but now we have the encampments, and you see the government response and the university response to the encampments. It's just delusional in its overreaction. And I would posit that it suggests a brittleness of their hold on power. It suggests an insecurity that is palpable. Around the encampments, the insecurity of the not only the government, but a sort of like system that for decades, Zionism has been just an unchallenged in both political parties. It's just been a consensus. And now you have young people saying, we don't agree with that consensus. And the freak out is profound. And that's because they feel the brittleness, they feel the insecurity of their own hold on that narrative and their own hold on that power.
And I do think the symbolism, because this is part of how we understand the mythology of the 60s, does now resonate for people where like the newsworthiness of that period and then the clampdown on it did end up doing the work of shifting political consensus, I think, just for regular people in a really interesting way that like, even if what made me think this was I saw an article recently of being like, where are the student protests against the Iran war, basically. And it was like, well, first of all, y'all locked down their campuses and then threw them in prison. So or at least, threw them off campus. And for some people who had varying degrees of, protection, ended up in immigrant detained in Louisiana and couldn't see the birth of their child. And so there's just the like, well, people are going to be a little more, the repression worked to some degree. But I also think like, because of this fetishization of mass physical action, the fact that like this moment of escalation in Iran is like the most unpopular war in polling, like in the history of the United States, since nerdy pollsters started polling. It's like 41% at the beginning of it.
I would say, I think this is kind of where you're going, but I would say that it's a good example of what we were talking about earlier about militancy and about pushing forward on all fronts, because what you had in the encampments is a kind of militancy, a kind of like direct action and civil disobedience that did exactly what it was designed to do. I mean, did it get repressed? Yes, it got repressed. But if you look at polling of the American public at large, but also just look at what's happened to the Democratic Party around the issue of Israel-Palestine since the encampments. Like those moments, and I'm not gonna be able to untangle every factor going into the changing of hearts and minds.
It's not only
one thing, but the encampments had a part to play in a vivid demonstration that America's young people were unwilling to go along with that consensus. And it fractured a consensus that has dominated the Democratic Party for decades. And so you have people like Zoran Mamdani or AOC or whatever being able to articulate positions that they may not have been able to 2 years ago, 4 years ago. I mean, or maybe they could have, but they wouldn't have had the sort of popular support of a movement behind them. And so, I think you could say we're not seeing those protests because they've been repressed, or you could say that militancy had the effect of changing the conversation, and now there are electoral pathways that were not open when that movement started. There were alternatives to vote for that didn't exist before people made clear that there was a constituency for them.
So I think the type of like reflection and self-interrogation and familiar interrogation that you do outside of even the political context is just not a thing that most people are going to be willing to do in their lives. Whether that's because they don't have the time to do it, whether that's because there are traumatic experiences that they can't face. I don't know how possible, and some people aren't writers also. There's something about putting things down and getting them out of your head that makes that possible.
And this legacy is uniquely documented.
Right, exactly. Most people don't have
FBI
the letters
archives.
and the FBI. But for those who are interested in their own lives in trying to understand like the how and why they got to be the person they are, but are maybe a little afraid of doing it, what would you say have been some of the gifts for you of doing that work?
Well, I mean, the gifts have been plentiful, honestly. Like part of it is just a more public gift, which is being in conversation about these things and being, getting to kind of talk to other people who are struggling in their own way, not necessarily with the same issues, but with like how to respond to the world as it is right now. More intimately, the gifts have been, first of all, like I feel like I understand my parents better and therefore understand myself better after doing this kind of work. And in terms of being a dad, I feel like when both my girls just read the book, they're among the first readers before it even comes out. And just getting to kind of have that conversation about their legacy and about how they understand where they came from, about like, wow, they knew their grandparents were these special people, but I don't think I knew all the details of what that specialness looked like on the ground.
And so with all that, as we get out of here, I think I have a potential game / little jaunt to play. So let's say the title of the book one more time. One, because people need to know where to get it and that they should get it, but two, because I think it pertains. What's the title of the book?
The title of the book is Dangerous, Dirty, Violent, and Young, A Fugitive Family in the Revolutionary Underground.
And so in talking with your dad about this, he always makes this point of your mom being mad at the idea of y'all being dirty, which leads me to what we call on this show AirGo parenting tips, which is how do you get through bath time with your kids? Let's recommend what's a bathtub toy that's been very helpful. Wow. Is it a bubble bath situation? For our young radical parents out there, how we get through bath time?
Very good question. So I'm an older radical parent, so my kids are 18. I have nothing to do with their baths
Let's go
anymore.
back. Yes.
When I go back, my main memory, we had a great toy. So our oldest, Dalen, is an artist. She's now in art school in New York. But from when she was 3 on, we had these washable crayons, and she would just sit in the bath for hours and cover the porcelain walls with murals. They were pretty amazing. Not super fun to clean up after every bath, but like she could sit there for 2 hours and she'd have whole menageries of animals and zoos and all sorts of things on the walls of the bath.
So you're willing to scrub, is what you're willing to get the.
You have to be willing.
Get the tub not dirty.
If it gives you a 2-hour break while they're making art, it's worth the scrubbing.
That's awesome. That's great.
Yeah.
Brought to you by Crayola.
Whatever.
Thank you so much for being
guys.
here to
Always
chop
a
it up with
pleasure.
us. How can folks find you and your work in the ways you'd like to be found?
Right on. So I haven't been a huge user of social media, but I'm trying to do some just to get the book out there. So I'm at Zayd Dohrn in all the usual places, ZaydDohrn. The book is, in wherever you buy your books, local independent bookstore. It'll be out May 19th. It's called Dangerous, Dirty, Violent, and Young. My website is Zayd Dohrn, ZaydDohrn.com. Has all the details about press tour and stuff. So, yeah.
Beautiful.
As we close, I just want to say thank you. Thank you for coming here, but thank you for this work. One, the modeling of what it means to like wrestle with your own existence and legacy. But this legacy is important to us, and your parents and family in many ways have like adopted us into the family.
And also like 80% of the white people we've had have just been members of your family at this point.
And so like, we have a love for like, it's funny, like we're much younger than you, but like we're like friends with your parents. So like they talk about their kids all the time. So I feel like I'm hearing about your updates. And so there's just like a love and a appreciation I have for your family, have for the way that y'all make home, the way that y'all take care of each other. And so not only being here, but this gift of like letting us know why we love y'all more means a lot and opens up the heart as well as teaching us.
I appreciate that. It's funny, growing up, my parents always had people who they had like adopted into the family. So I feel like I have siblings of every age in Chicago. But I feel that way about you guys.
Yeah,
Thank
appreciate you.
Beautiful. All right, we'll be back reshaping culture for the more liberatory and creative.
Much love to the people.
Peace.